Thank you, ISACA Houston, for the opportunity to talk about CMMC. Today, we're going to talk about how to avoid the frustration of navigating through the journey to CMMC and NIST 800-171 compliance. My name is Kyle Lai, President and Chief Information Security Officer at KLC Consulting. We are the C3PAO in the CMMC ecosystem. So I have over 20 years of experience in cybersecurity, but most importantly, I was the operations manager for Defense Information System Agency, and I have over 10 years of experience with DoD Risk Management Framework, RMF. If there is a defense contractor system that need to go on the DoD network, you have to go through this risk management framework authorization to operate, right? And also we have experience with NIST 853, the NIST 800-171, as well as CMMC. So there are a lot of acronyms, buzzwords out there: CUI, FCI, SSP, POAM, DFARS, 7012, CMMC, SSP. There are a lot of these acronyms. So there cause a lot of confusion and the frustration, because if you just start learning about these acronyms, you will get frustrated. So that's why we're having this presentation today. We're going to decipher some of these acronyms. We're going to talk about what is CUI, Control Unclassified Information, right? What is NIST 800-171? What is CMMC? And they talk about different DFARS, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations, right? What are some of these DFARS? And they're actually talking about the journey to CMMC. What does it look like, right? Okay, so what is CUI? CUI is Control Unclassified Information. CUI is something that government creates or owned, or something that you create, right, for the government. And that government require you with a CUI. They require you to safeguarding this information. And remember, it's unclassified information. CUI is a government created or owned information that require protection based on the applicable laws or regulations or government-wide policies. And this could be something that government create, government owned, or something that you create for the government as well. And for DoD, these are going to be covered defense information. And within covered defense information, there's a category called Control Technical Information. We are going to take a look at it a little bit more. And all these categories, different CUI categories, they are listed in the CUI registry. DoD have a CUI registry, dodcui.mil, and that's where we're going to take a look next. Okay, there are 4 different types of CUI categories that are falling into the covered defense information. And these are control technical information, as we just mentioned. And there are critical infrastructure security information. And there are nuclear information. But what we are going to focus on is going to be on the control technical information. Most of the companies that deal with the DoD CUI are going to focus on the CTI, the Control Technical Information. And on the right side, you will see just some example. The CTI example, there are research information, drawings, specifications, technical reports, or some source code. Just some example of what is considered CTI. So how do you determine what is CUI, CTI? How do you go about it? If you start from this diagram, right, you will determine to see if this information that you are receiving, is this classified information or unclassified information. If it is classified information, you follow a different DoD 5200.01, right? You follow that to determine if it's a classified information. However, if it's an unclassified information, you go to the next step. So on the right side, you will see if this information fall within the law, regulation, or government-wide policy. If it is, then it is CUI. If it's not, then it is not CUI. If it is CUI, then you will go into the DoD CUI registry, we just mentioned. And from that registry, you will determine which category this information fall into. There is a requirement for DoD marking. That means marking the document as CUI. For control technical information, you mark as CUI, specification, as a control technical information. We are not going to get into the marking in this presentation, but I strongly suggest that you go through the DoD mandatory CUI training that will go through some of the marking for you. So let's take a look at what is NIST 800-171. NIST 800-171 has been out since 2018. It provides the security requirements to protect CUI. And the NIST 800-171 applies to all the federal government contractors and subcontractors, right? That means a lot of people. If you or other company that you work with have a contract with government or DoD that is handling, processing, transmitting CUI, then you have to comply with NIST 800-171. And this is associated with the DFARS 252-204-7012. We'll talk a little bit about this DFARS later. Right, so what is CMMC? CMMC is Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. Cybersecurity requirements from DoD to defense industrial-based companies. And CMMC provides additional assurance to DoD that defense industrial-based companies can adequately protect sensitive information and be accountable for information flow down to their subcontractors in the supply chain. But you might ask, hey, NIST 800-171 is already been out since 2018. Why do we actually need to have another CMMC certification? There's a GAO, a Government Accountability Office. They did an investigation in the last 2-3 years and found out that most of the companies, or 80% or close to 80% or more of the companies that should have done the self-assessment for the 800-171 are in fact either did not do it or did not do it properly. So that's why there are still a lot of breach. There's a lot of data breach. There are a lot of security incidents on the company that supposedly have done the self-assessment on the NIST 800-171. So with a CMMC, now the government, now DoD is coming out and say, okay, so we want you to do the self-assessment, and we trust that you will do the self-assessment, but we want to verify. And in order to do verification, we want to have this CMMC certification, right? So you do it, and then we will verify and give you the certification saying you have done this security practice properly, based on the processes and practices that you have, we'll verify. And there are 5 different maturity levels, maturity level 1 to maturity level 5. We're going to take a look at the next few slides. In order for you to get the CMMC certification, it is required that you get the certification assessment by the CMMC third-party assessment organization, which is C3PAO. And CMMC certification can only be granted by CMMC accreditation body, which is CMMC AB. There are selected contracts that will be required a CMMC certification between 2021 to 2025. So not all contracts require CMMC. So if you have a contract that requires CMMC, you will know because it will be specified in the contract. If you win the contract and by the time you need to perform the work, you must have the CMMC certification if CMMC certification requirement is in your contract. Starting in 2026, all DoD contracts will require defense contractors to have CMMC certification. Minimum CMMC level 1. Contract requires CUI will require CMMC level 3. So as mentioned, CMMC level 1 have 17 practices. It does not require any documentation, but it's obviously recommended that you have some kind of a documentation security policies to make your assessment go a little bit smoother. CMMC level 1 are required for all the defense contractors, the defense industrial-based companies that handle non-public federal contract information, or FCI. And these FCIs are contract information that are not meant to be public. For example, there are some specific statement of work that is designed to be just for you, or performance requirements that is designed just for you, the defense contractors. They are not meant to be public. So those are considered FCI, right? Maturity level 2, there are just a transition between maturity level 1 and 3. So most companies will not consider maturity level 2 certification. Maturity level 3 have 130 practices. For the defense industrial-based companies that handle CUI, they must have maturity level 3 certification in order to handle CUI. Maturity level 4 and 5, those are the contracts that are a little bit more sensitive. And if DoD think that companies or the prime contractors will most likely be targeted by the other nation state attacks, then they will require CMMC maturity 4 and 5. Most companies will not go there because level 4 and level 5 require a lot additional security practices that is constantly looking for threats and looking for nation state attacks. So most likely you will see you falling into the CMMC level 1 or CMMC level 3. In this talk, we'll focus on CMMC maturity level 3. Okay, and you can take a look at on the left side here, there are 17 capability domains within the CMMC. And these are just domains that, kind of are broken out, 130 practices into these 17 domains. And these are access control, and how do you do your incident response, for example, and how do you do the awareness and training how do you educate your staff and employees to make sure they are aware and understanding some of the attacks, for example, phishing. How do you actually train them to do their job properly? And how do you train them to protect their information properly? Right. And on the right side, these are just 5 different levels. So level 1, as we mentioned, they are covering the basic security hygiene, right? And the level 3 are good cyber hygienes, good enough to handle the CUI. So let's talk about DFARS 7012. So the official number is 252.204.7012. This is to safeguard covered defense information and the cyber incident reporting, right? So what does DFARS 7012 covers? DFARS 7012 requires contractors and subcontractors to provide adequate security to safeguard covered defense information, right, that resides on the contractor's internal information system or network, which is NIST 800-171. It also required the contractors and subcontractors to report cyber incidents that affects the covered contractor information system or covered defense information that reside within the contractor's network, right? And if there is any incident, you have to report, and you also have to submit the malicious software or malware or virus that you actually caught. They might ask you for the image of a computer that got compromised. So make sure that you have a copy of the hard drive or the computer that was being compromised, an image of what's been compromised. So there's also a flow down clause to make sure that your subcontractors understand that they have to follow the DFARS 7012. Right? There's a requirements for you to make sure that your subcontractors understand how to protect the covered defense information as well. So what is covered contractor information system? It means unclassified information system that are owned and operated by the contractors or subcontractors that process, store, and transmit covered defense information, right? So what is covered defense information? I think we touched a little bit already, right? It means it's unclassified control technical information or other informations, right, in that CUI registry, right? And also, if you take a look at your DoD contract, your current DoD contracts that involve CUI, most likely you will see DFARS 252.204.7012 already on your contract. So that means you have to be in compliance with DFARS 7012 today if that clause is already on your contract, right? And also, hey, how soon do I have to report a security incident? It says I have to report the incident. You have 72 hours to report the incidents from the time of the discovery. 72 hours. So how do you report? So if you have a security incident, this is how you report. You have to report to DoD Cybercrime Center, who is DC3, through this portal, divnet.dod.mil, right? So this is where you report on the left side. Make sure you go to the left side where it says Cyber Reports. You will click on the report, the cyber incident. But here's a catch, right? You need to have the what they call the medium assurance certificate in order to report a cyber incident. What happens if you don't have a certificate? That means you are stuck. You are not going to be able to report the incident. But if you already say you are in compliance with the DFARS, make sure that you have the certificate. And what we call that is a ECA certificate. You want to follow the process, go to this website and you will be able to purchase that certificate. Just follow the process and order your ECA certificate, right? Once you have the certificate, you will have all the requirements to report a cyber incident. So make sure that you have this certificate so you can be fully compliant with DFARS 7012. So what are some of the other DFARS clauses? So let's take a look at DFARS 7019 and 7020. 7019 and 7020, they are talking about NIST 800-171. There's a new requirement for you to submit your self-assessment and the assessment score to the DoD SPRS system. So 7019 is the requirement telling you that there is this requirement. 7020 specify the assessment methodology and the DoD SPRS submission instruction. Basically, you need to have the system security plan. You need to have a plan of action and milestone. You need to have the assessment score, right? And you need to have the date when you are going to implement all the practices that is required in the NIST 800-171. When are you going to be done, right? And DoD reserve the right to audit. They let you know DoD have the rights to do the audit. If you say you have the self-assessment done, and here's the score, and if you say you are done with 110, DoD have the right to actually come out and check you out, right? They're not going to select too many companies to do that, but there's a possibility that will come out to audit you. Let's take a look at DFARS 7021. 7021, it basically is just the CMMC requirements. Yeah, all the thing that we talk about on the CMMC, it's in here. So we talked about SSP and the POAM. So what is System Security Plan, or SSP? System Security Plan is a documentation of 110 practices for NIST 800-171 or 130 practices for CMMC Maturity Level 3. CUI scope and boundary diagram is required. SSP expects you to have the CUI asset inventory documented or referred, or however you want to do it, but you need to have the CUI asset inventory. right? And you need to have a policy reference of your practices or policy procedures. You need to have them referred in your SSP or documented in your SSP. And you have to have an incident response plan, right, in the SSP. How about plan of action and milestone? So plan of action and milestone documents the deficiencies and unimplemented practices. If you have something that you have not implemented, how are you going to implement them, right? And you provide some estimated timeline when you are going to get this done. And you probably want to identify who is going to be responsible for implementing these POAM items. So how do you actually define the CUI scope and boundary? It's very confusing, right? How do I know how do I know what system do I have? Do I actually have to take care of all my systems within the company? Or how do I know what system contains CUI? How do I know? Very confusing. But let me give you a tip. The best way to go about finding out your CUI scope and boundary is to use a CUI data lifecycle. And there are 6 steps. You want to go through the CUI input and creation, like what information is coming in. You want to go with CUI storage, know where information is stored. You want to go into the usage, who are using it, right? And how are you using it? And sharing, who are you sharing? And backup and disposal at the end. These are very high-level CUI data lifecycle that you can go through. Let's just dig in a little bit. CUI input and creation. So from here, you want to get into understanding who do you get the CUI information from? What kind of information are you getting into your environment, right? And what information do you create that is considered CUI? So let's dig in a little bit more, right? CUI, if you're getting this CUI information from your prime contractors or from DoD, you want to document what information are you getting? Are those like technical drawings, specifications, reports, or source code? What information are you getting in? For this type of information, you want to check out the CUI registry, right? And just try to understand what information you are getting into your environment, right? And where are you getting it from? How do you getting the information? For the creation, how do you create the information? Who are creating those information, right? So you want to get some understanding on what information are getting in and when are they getting into your environment. Once you have this information, you have to store somewhere, right? So you want to identify, where do I store that information, that CUI information? That CUI information could be stored on your file server or email, or is that Microsoft Exchange or Microsoft OneDrive, SharePoint, or is that somewhere, storage, box.com, somewhere that you actually use to store the information? Where is the information stored? You want to identify these storage, where those are located, who is managing it, right? And how do you manage it? Are those encrypted? So those are the information that you want to gather. Now you have the CUI usage. Who are using the CUI? Who from all the departments? You probably want to identify the different departments that are actually accessing these CUI information. Which role or person within each business unit or business groups are actually touching, using, storing, transmitting the CUI information. You want to identify them. And how do they use it? What do they use it for? Right? You want to document this information. Right? And if they are using it, do they actually use it? Do they have a two-factor authentication, or how do they actually access this information? Okay? And then we get into the CUI sharing. You most likely will share this information with your subcontractors if you need your subcontractors to do some work, right? Related to the DoD contract. So that means you are sharing some kind of a CUI information to your subcontractors. So you want to understand who you share this information with. How do you share them? What is the mechanism that you use to share this information? Do you use some secure FTP, or do you use some kind of a tool like box.com, or do you use SharePoint? How do you share this information? Or do you actually use secure email? How do you share this information with your subcontractors? And also, how do you share this information back to your customers? DoD or your prime contractors, or maybe you are the third or fourth tier subcontractors. How do you share this back to the subcontractors that hire you to do the work, right? How do you share this information back? What is the mechanism? You want to get this information. Okay, now let's go to the CUI backup or archiving. You might have the CUI being backed up somewhere, right? Where are they being backed up? Are they actually being backed up on your local drive, or do you actually have a store somewhere in the cloud? If you have the store in the cloud, do you have the cloud service, identify the cloud service provider or the backup service provider? Right now you want to get into understanding the backup service provider or the backup mechanism. Are they secure? Are they transmitting the data securely? Do they have the encryption at the cloud service provider or the backup service provider, right? And how do they access it? Who have access to this backup, right? Then we get into the Cui disposal and destruction. Maybe at the end of the contract, it requires you to destroy the data that you are giving, all the Cui information that you are giving. Maybe it's the customer, they may request to destroy the data that they were sent to you. Or maybe it's the server hard drive that you are deciding to upgrade the server. You have to rebuild the server. So if the server actually have CUI information, you have to wipe the information right on your hard drive. How do you do it securely? There's a NIST 888 that specifies how do you wipe or how do you destroy the CUI information properly. So recommend to go into that documentation if you have time. Right. So that is, you also want to consider, there's another thing you want to consider. Paper is also could be a media, right? You want to destroy the paper, shred it properly based on the NIST requirements. And also, if you have a copier or printer that you lease, those are big copier or printer that you lease from these copier companies, right? You probably want to understand that there is a hard drive on each of these big printer and copier. And most likely every single page that you have ever copied, printed on that box, on that printer, has been stored on the hard drive, right? So if your printer copier requires some maintenance, at the end of the lease period, you want to return the copier or printer. You want to make sure that data that's on the hard drive has been cleaned. Otherwise, you are giving them a lot of information. Just think about how much information is you have been copied and printed, since day one of the lease. Okay, so once you have gone through this CUI data lifecycle, now you have a really good understanding in terms of where's the CUI coming in, where do I store, who is using it. Now I understand what type of information, the data, CUI data that I have. I understand the system that are actually accessing this CUI data. I also understand all my outside of my on-premises system, some of the system in the cloud, what are actually used, touching, transmitting, storing the CUI information, right? And also I understand who within my organization have access to the CUI. So with all this information we put together, now this becomes your CUI scope. And that is going to be very clear once you go through this exercise. I know we've gone through a lot of information, right? And a lot of information, so you kind of get some understanding in terms of what is CUI, some of the acronyms, DFARS, 7012, 7019, 7020, CMMC, NIST 800-171, right? And some of these acronyms, CUI, what is CUI, what is covered defense information, what is covered technical, controlled technical information, right? So now I think you are pretty much ready to get into understanding on what is the journey of CMMC maturity level 3 look like. When you are ready to go for the CMMC maturity level 3, this is what you have to do, right? To make sure that you have the scope ready. Scope, as we just talked about, make sure you scope your CUI properly. Define your CUI scope and boundary, and go through their data flow, data lifecycle, and have a very clear documentation on what is your CUI asset inventory. Then before you want to go into CMMC level 3, as I have mentioned earlier, you also need to comply with DFARS 7012, 7019, 7020. That means you have to meet the NIST 800-171 first. So you want to do the NIST 800-171 self-assessment. And you want to create a system security plan. Make sure you have one. And if you still have some kind of a deficiency, right, you want to create a plan of action and milestone and to identify, document the gaps and gap remediation steps. How do you fix, or how do you address the deficiencies? How do you address the POAM items? You want to prioritize the POAM items so you understand what to do first and next, right? And then you want to give an estimated time when you are going to complete all 110 practices, when you are going to be done, right? Then you want to submit the assessment summary score to DoD SPRS, which is required by 7019 and 7020, right? So once you submit to SPRS, you are in compliance with DFARS 7012, 7019, 7020, right? It doesn't matter if you haven't got everything done yet, but you already done what is required for these DFARS clauses, and you already given them a plan on how you are going to achieve, how and when you are going to achieve the completion of all 110 practices, right? And remember, we just talked about that you want to have a certificate, medium assurance certificate, the ECI certificate, so you can report the incident. Make sure you have that certificate, right? And then make sure you have a incident response plan that is effective. Then you want to start working through the 110 practices that's on the POAM, right? Make sure you complete all the 110 practices. When you're done with that, you're ready to go for CMMC. If you are in compliance with DFARS 7012 and NIST 800-171, you are probably 90-95% there, to move to CMMC level 3. You probably want to assess the gaps in terms of what's left for you to achieve CMMC level 3. You just want to go through and understand what are some additional things you have to do, what are some of the gaps, and address those gaps. You probably want to do a pre-assessment, kind of do a self-assessment, or kind of a pre-assessment against the CMMC maturity level 3 assessment guide, just to see how good you are. Are you in pretty good shape to go through the CMMC assessment? Right? You can hire a assessor from a different C3PAO organization to come to do the assessment, the pre-assessment for you, just to, from their opinion, do they think you will pass? Or are there additional things that you have to do before you go for the final CMMC assessment, right? So you can do that. Or when you're ready, you want to schedule a CMMC assessment with a C3PAO. So you want to schedule and to do the performance of the CMMC final assessment. So this is the process for the final CMMC assessment. You want to confirm, as we just mentioned, confirm that you have the practices, policies, procedures, evidence. Let me talk about the evidence. Evidence is to, some evidence or some form of evidence to show that your practice is effective. Usually there are three different types of evidence. One is the policy procedures, something that you have documented. Second thing is they might use interview. They might just talk to some of your staff to see if they fully understand what need to be done or what is practiced, what is the practice about. They might be doing the interview. Or they might be asking your staff to perform or show them the actual evidence that happened on the system. Let me give you an example. If they are talking about two-factor authentication, they might ask you for, do you have a two-factor authentication policy or procedure? Okay, you do have that. Okay, how about, let me talk to one of your staff and see what they're understanding about for the two-factor authentication. Or they might be looking for the evidence just to ask the staff to walk me through how do you log in to this website or this system to show them that they actually have used the two-factor authentication. So these are three different types of evidence that the assessor might be requiring. So policy, procedure, or doing through the interview, or looking the evidence on the system. In order to pass that practice, you will need 2 out of 3 type of evidence to support the effectiveness of the practice. And for CUI, and you want to make sure you have the CUI scope and boundary diagram. And just to make sure that you understand, for CMMC final assessment, you cannot have a POAM item saying that, hey, I'm actually 129 practices done. I only have 1 practice that I have a POAM, right? I'm going to get this done in 30 days. If you have a POAM item that you have not addressed completely, you cannot go through CMMC because CMMC require you to have all 130 practices completed before you go through the CMMC assessment. Otherwise, they probably will not even start the CMMC assessment with your company. Right, so you have to find the CMMC C3PAO to perform the CMMC Maturity Level 3 assessment. Schedule, perform the assessment. And if the C3PAO determine that you have meet all the conformance to the CMMC Maturity Level 3 requirements, then CMMC AB will validate the C3PAO's package, the entire package, right? And if there are no issue, congratulations, CMMC AB will grant you the CMMC Level 3 certification. Just a note, it is a long process. The certification process may take up to 3 months, so just plan accordingly. So let's go through these frequent asked questions. For DoD SPRS or DFARS 7019, 7020 requirements, how much time do I have to remediate these POAM items? There's not really a set number, but based on our experience, usually companies take about 6 to 12 months to do the remediation. Usually I would say within one year, within 12 months, I think it's pretty okay. If you go over 1 year, it might raise a little bit eyebrows, right? So I would say usually one year, 12 months, I think is pretty safe. When do I get CMMC certification? As I mentioned earlier, CMMC certification, it's not going to be something that is required for you unless there is a contract that require you to have the CMMC. 2021 to 2025, these are the 5 years that only selected contracts will require the CMMC. But after 2020, starting in 2026, all contracts will require CMMC, at least for CMMC level 1, right? So I will say you don't have to go for the CMMC certification right away, but you want to make sure that you have DFARS 7012. Make sure you have that. Make sure you have a DFARS 7012 in place. That is something that is more real. That is something the contract officers will measure you against, right? And DFARS 7019 and 7020, those are something that you have to be in compliance with right now. How do I know what CUI I have, right? These, again, fall into the CUI registry. But in terms of what information you are getting from your DoD or DoD primes, if they are not marked as CUI, you don't even know you don't know if they are CUI or not, then you probably want to go to your contract officer representative, the core, to ask them to clarify what are some information, make sure they mark the CUI. If they are not marked, have some kind of agreement with them, have the direction from your core, from DoD contract or from DoD side, some instruction from your contract officer or from your prime contractor program manager to tell you what is considered CUI on the contract. You might be able to make some suggestions to them, but the direction still should come from your customer, right? And make sure that it's clear. What happens if you think or you know that you are receiving CUI, but the core, your DoD contract officers or prime contractor program managers, they are sometimes a little bit behind on understanding what CUI is. They just cannot give you a definite answer on what is CUI, what is not CUI, or what is CUI. What is the best way forward? If you keep pushing and your DoD core and the prime contractor program managers, they still cannot give you the information on what is CUI. Make sure you document that the communication. Hey, all these email communications, we have already asked the contract officers and the prime contractors for their direction on what is considered CUI. So we already have this communication several times. We still cannot get a clarification on what is CUI. We have documentation. Here are all the information that we have. Right? Here's very clearly, here's all the communication that we have with the primes. So we really tried our best, right? So we still cannot get it. So I think this is more like a CYA. You have that type of evidence to show that you are doing your best to try to get the CUI information. You might be able to educate your contract officers and the primes, a little bit about like, here is the contract, here is the CUI registry, here is what we think that we are getting. Can we actually just agree that these are just the CUI information, right? You can make that suggestion. However, the direction still have to come from your contract officer, just to make sure that is the rule of thumb. The direction have to come from, the direction and the instruction for what is considered CUI should be coming from your DoD customer, the core, or your prime contractor, the program manager. Okay, so here are some useful resources for you. These are the information that you will be able to use to learn a little bit more about what CMMC, the CUI, DFARS 7012, the actual clause, right? And also the actual NIST 800-171, the language. So here are a lot of good information for you, and we will provide these slides available to all the audience. If you have any other questions, please feel free to contact me. And here's my contact information. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope you find this presentation helpful. Feel free to contact us at any time. Thank you.